anybody who couldn't join us.
Well, we are now recording.
Yay, thank you.
Alrighty, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, excited to spend some time with you all this afternoon. It's a good afternoon for this because if it were yesterday, we would all want to be outside. So excited to spend a Friday afternoon with you guys talking about this important topic. My name is Lauren Johnson, and I'm the Director of Communications and Community Outreach at the Polk County Housing Trust Fund. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do and a little bit of background on bringing this exhibit to Des Moines before I kick it over to Kendall for the tour. So the Polk County Housing Trust Fund has, three primary responsibilities. The first of which is funding of affordable housing. So this includes the construction of new affordable housing at any place in Polk County, as well as some funds for owner-occupied repairs, and additionally funds for programs and supportive services for our service providers such as Anawim Housing, Home Incorporated, some names that you all might know. And what really these funds go to are making sure that folks can get into housing and then stay into that housing once they get there. And so then the second kind of branch of what we do is research and planning work. That's Kendall's job, and she can maybe get into that a little bit later. But the research and planning work is really looking at data to better understand the needs in Polk County and to see where we need more housing, and kind of what the situation on the ground is, so that we can do the third branch of our responsibilities a little bit better, and that's advocacy and policy. So really just advocating on the local, state, and sometimes federal level for housing friendly policies, of course, driven by data and what we know from our research and planning work. And things like that include working with different cities, may it be Clive, Des Moines, West Des Moines, Norwalk even sometimes, to help them plan better for the incoming population. And so as part of this advocacy and policy work, but also it turned into a research and planning project as well, we brought this exhibit, Undesign the Redline, to Des Moines for the first time just a little over a year ago. So this exhibit was created by a firm out of New York called Designing the We. And this firm has put this exhibit up all across the country in places as big as, Los Angeles area in California, to a more comparable sized city in Omaha, just our neighbors to the west there. And what this exhibit does, and the base exhibit that we brought last April, is look at the history of redlining and just the kind of string of federal policy decisions that followed redlining, that really took us to the situation that we're at today, with a very large, very substantial racial wealth gap, and tracing a lot of those issues back to redlining and kind of the thinking that spurred the policies in the 1930s that came from it. So following the exhibit in April, we decided to take it a step further, because that was really a base exhibit that looked at it from a national level. We decided to continue this work and do a little bit more research to understand what exactly this looked like in Des Moines, and what the history of really Black home ownership is in the Des Moines metro and in Iowa at large. So throughout the fall of 2019, we conducted that research by digging into some national archives as well as the Des Moines Register archives. And we also formed a community advisory group that was filled with African-American community members who really told us their stories and gave us more perspective as to what they experienced throughout this time. So after that all wrapped up, and it's still ongoing, but after we had enough information to present it to the public, we did open the exhibit at Franklin Junior High with help from our sponsors at Wells Fargo, Mid-Iowa Health Foundation, and the Directors Council. We opened the exhibit in early January of 2020, and then we're giving public tours multiple times a week through mid-March, in which we had to of course, closed the exhibit temporarily due to COVID. And so we're very excited that we can continue spreading this information and talking to new people every day to really learn the lessons that this has to teach us, and excited to do that via Zoom with you guys today. So with that, I don't think I left anything out. I'll kick it over to Kendall to start the tour. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you guys for joining. And if you guys have any questions while the presentation is going on, please feel free to type your question in the chat if you'd like, or you can also just save it until the end when we'll have just a little discussion and answer your questions if you have any. So with that, as we get into this, before we even talk about redlining, we kind of want to just look at the current state of the city of Des Moines and at Polk County at large. And so the first thing that you're looking at here on the left side of the screen are some infographics from the One Economy report, which it looks at the state of Black Polk County. This report is from 2017, and they're currently updating it, so we're hopefully going to get some new data soon from their new report. But essentially, this is looking at African Americans in Polk County in a multitude of different factions, but one of them being housing. And so these are some infographics from that report. And one of the biggest ones we want to point out is that African Americans are denied loans at a rate 2.1 times higher than the Polk County average. So that's, as you can see there, that's 24% are denied. And so that's a really large, 2 times is really large. And so we can see as we'll go through the exhibit that, or the exhibit presentation, of how these mortgage lending processes still continue to happen today, even though they're not necessarily explicitly racist as they were back in the 1930s. And then also another point here to take away is that when we look at the median value of single family homes in Polk County, when we look at all census tracts, so those are the 2 purple houses that you see in that infographic, the median value is about a little over $140,000. And so when we then take a look at the all minority census tracts, and these are census tracts that have over 25 to 30% of a minority group or multiple minorities. And so when we look at these specific census tracts, their median value single family homes are half of all census tracts. They're about 70,000. So that's just another really big difference that we see on the ground in our community. And then also, a lot of these statistics are from 2010, but really, we're looking at that in Polk County, African Americans represented about 11.2% of all renters, while only representing about 6% of the total population. And as part of that 11.2% of the rentership, about 65% of that 11.2% are cost burdened, meaning that they pay more than 30% of their income towards rent and utilities. So a very, very large portion of the African American community that is renters are very cost burdened. That's a really high amount. So just keeping this in mind. And we see these data points are from 2010, but these trends continue to happen as we look at data over time and continue to research that. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a map of the city of Des Moines, and we have a few streets there that are not as accurate as they probably could be, but just to give you a visual of MLK, Hickman, and University. And essentially this map is, it's from HUD, their Furthering Fair Housing Data and Mapping tool. And you're looking at demographic data. So the orange dots represent the white population, and the green dots represent the African American population. And so each dot represents 5 people, just to give you an idea. And so we see that there are certain parts of the city that have higher concentrations of African Americans, and specifically between those 3 streets that we point out there in those neighborhoods. as well as across the river to the east as well. There's specific areas of the city that have those concentrations. And so really we want to point this out because as we continue to look at maps throughout this exhibit tour, you'll see that this continues to be a point in the exhibit. And to see what it looks like today compared to, say, the redlining map back in 1930 and understanding those policies, it's very, very apparent that this is very embedded in where people live and have the ability to live in our city. And so as we move on, we're moving into a new report. This is the Neighborhood Revitalization Report done in 2018 for the city of Des Moines. And we're going to look at 3 maps that were created as part of that report. The first map is looking at the current property condition. And so you can see on the furthest right-hand side of your screen, a field survey scoring system that is used to tell you why each area is given a certain color on the map, what each parcel is given. And it goes from 1, which is in excellent condition, and then all the way to red, which is the highest levels of distress. And so those neighborhoods where we also see the highest concentrations of African Americans in our community are also a lot of the areas that we see mild to high distress within the property conditions as well. And you can see that in the representation here of all this red. And it even goes up into here along the river going north as well. And then the next map is looking at current property values. And so again, the areas with the lightest colors are the areas where you have the residential parcels with building with the lowest assessed values. And so again, those are the areas where we also see not just the levels of distress and the more rundown conditions of properties, but also where we have the most concentration of African Americans, and also, I didn't point at this, but also where we see the highest amount of concentration of poverty in our city as well. And so the last 2 maps then were put together to create a final map for the city to use to make decisions. And it's the current neighborhood condition map. And so essentially they took each neighborhood using a bunch of different data, including the 2 maps before with property condition values, as well as looking at poverty, and then creating this map to show you the condition of the neighborhood, going from 1 or green, which is very healthy, to 6 with the dark magenta pink color, which is the very unhealthy neighborhoods. And so when we look at those light pink and dark pink areas, again, those are the areas where we see that they're seen as very unhealthy parts of our city, and it's where we see a majority of our African American population living within them. And this report led to the creation of Invest DSM and the choosing of specific neighborhoods that should get investment through the funding that would come through this program. And a lot of the 3 out of the 4 neighborhoods that were chosen were the neighborhoods that fall into the 3-ish and into the 4 category. So the places that aren't the worst, that they think are too far gone, that we can't do anything about, and really just focusing on pretty okay areas of the city. And so with that, we're going to move on into the redlining section and the history, but we kind of created this paragraph as kind of a mental preparedness paragraph to get everybody in the mindset to understand this history. And it reads, America has promoted the notion of white supremacy since the country's inception, beginning with 250 years of slavery. It forced segregation of races both geographically and economically, and that didn't end with the Civil War. These segregationist attitudes continued from Jim Crow laws separating whites and blacks in public accommodations to also miscegenation laws. America really sought every avenue to make sure that the races did not mix, and this wasn't different in housing. So welcome to redlining. So what is redlining? Redlining was the concept of redlining and the organization that helped start what we now know as redlining. Was started in the 1930s as part of the New Deal era programs that President Roosevelt was pushing and creating to help bring the United States out of the Great Depression. So really all of these New Deal programs, there's a bunch of them, were really trying to create a social safety net and to help build wealth across the United States. And so one of these programs that was created in the first 100 days of these programs being put out by the president was the Homeowners Loan Act. And this created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which essentially was given money to help. It's kind of like an emergency fund and an emergency organization to help homeowners and help banks, especially banks, help with those delinquent loans to really make sure that people are able to stay in their homes and banks to not fail across the United States. And then that was in 1933. And then in 1934, to create more of a robust housing services and social safety net organization, President Roosevelt then created the National Housing Act of 1934, which created the Federal Housing Administration. And this then takes in what Holk had been starting to do in 1933 and passing out funds to banks across the United States, and really wanting to revive mortgage lending. And it was also when we have the creation of the 30-year mortgage by the FHA, saying that we will help refinance your loans if you agree to have longer term loans with smaller interest rates. So this is really that start of trying to get more people into that, creating that American dream of home ownership in the United States after the Great Depression. But we also have to remember that at this point in time, when all of these programs are being implemented into the United States, Congress is really wanting to make sure that baked into these programs are ways to systemically cut out people of color from benefiting from them. And this does not skip over the Federal Housing Administration or the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the mortgage lending process of helping people get into home ownership. And so this is essentially how the Jim Crow era segregation is brought into home ownership across the United States. And so really, there were 239 cities across the United States that got these, what we now call as redlining maps. These maps were created because with all of this money from the federal government being passed out to banks for the mortgage lending, they realized they needed to have some criteria to make sure banks were putting the money in the right hands, essentially, and in the right places. And so they created these maps, which were essentially risk management maps. Each neighborhood got a color and criteria associated with it. At this point in time, individuals didn't have credit scores, so there wasn't a way to assess risk based on a family. And so this is what these maps were meant to do. They were called residential security maps. And so each of these maps, you can see there's an example here. This is obviously not the city of Des Moines. This is the Bronx from New York. And to really understand how to read these, I'm just going to go through each color. And just broadly, what they really focused on when they were going through a neighborhood to determine what color it should receive. It was looking not just at demographic data, including race and economic status, but it was also looking at property condition. It was looking at property values, renting costs, all those different things, what the buildings were actually made of. Was it brick? Was it concrete? Was it wood? All of these different things played into it. But one of the biggest that was, one of the biggest red flags in a neighborhood was race. And so you'll see that as I continue on. But when we look at how to read these maps, we'll start with the green areas, and the green areas were seen as the best areas of the city, the lowest risk. Predominantly, these were areas that had a lot of white families living there. And so when they thought about risk, white families were a low risk group that they knew would pay back their loans, versus an African American family that they were higher risk because it was seen that they wouldn't be able to pay back their loan. And so these were the lowest risk areas of the city where investment should continue to happen and where banks should continue to put their best loans and most of their money into. And then we have the blue areas. These were still good areas of the city, still pretty low risk. They were predominantly white again, so that's why they were really seen as lower risk. And so these were areas that were still primed for investment, and banks should continue to put money into these areas without hesitation. And then we get into the yellow areas, or the areas that were termed by the federal government as being declining neighborhoods. And they were declining, seen as declining for a multitude of reasons. Some of those include the racial composition or also the economic classes that lived within these areas. And so they were seen as higher risk neighborhoods. And so essentially the federal government was warning banks and saying, you need to be cautious when you're going to be putting money into these neighborhoods. Be careful about who you give your money to. And essentially saying you can feel safe enough to give money to white families, but don't give it to anybody else. And then we move into the red areas. The red areas were termed as hazardous neighborhoods, and these were the highest risk neighborhoods. And banks were told by the federal government to not put money into these neighborhoods, to completely cut off investment, because they had the highest concentrations of these groups that were adverse influences, or detrimental influences to a neighborhood, and that they were also highest risk in making sure that they would be able to pay their loans back. And so with this, these red neighborhoods then were completely cut off from investment, which then started with home loans, but then also went into people couldn't get business loans as well. It also meant that insurance was taken away from these areas as well. And the bank branches that had once been there started to move and relocate to other parts of the city where they were actually putting money into. And so it allowed, there was a big vacancy, and it allowed a lot of subprime lenders and predatory banking to come into these neighborhoods and to start extracting wealth from these communities. And so really we're looking at that. Redlining really embodies this process that took explicit racism and then put it into structural racism, into how our cities would develop over time. And so when we're looking at the geography and also specifically looking at the wealth gap that this created, because home ownership is the biggest way to build wealth in this country, that was created really by this system. All of these really still exist today. We have a major wealth gap in our country. And we have a lot of cities that are still very segregated. And especially, we even see this in the city of Des Moines. And so with these maps, when you got this map, you maybe didn't know why a green area was a green area or a red area was a red area. And so each map got a packet with it that essentially were these books of area descriptions. It told you why a certain neighborhood got a certain color. And these images here are just an example from the city of Des Moines area descriptions. And it says here, it's a D6, and on the next slide, which has our map, you can see where that D6 area is. But it specifically says that it's laboring class, so really a poor class, and that on the west side is a colored district. So because there was a large section that was a colored district, specifically at this point in time in the city of Des Moines, an African American district, that was a big, big red flag. And so it gave it a D rating almost automatically. But also, the language that's used within these area descriptions also talked about the infiltration of hazardous populations. And so when we look at things like the green areas, it wasn't necessarily just where white people lived, but it was areas where it had restrictions on the infiltration of these hazardous populations. So they had racial covenants on entire neighborhoods saying this is a whites only neighborhood, or restrictive deeds on individual houses that said you can only sell this house to a white family. Or you cannot sell this house to a black family. And so it was these areas that we see these restrictions, and the government really saw that these restrictions were really, really effective in limiting the hazardous infiltration from these specific groups. And so it was really seen as a way to make sure that real estate values were secured in a city. So as we take a look here at the city of Des Moines map, you can see that on the east side of the river, it's a lot of red and yellow. And then on the west side, it's most of the green on the west side of the city of Des Moines. And for Des Moines residents, for Metro residents, this doesn't seem surprising. We know that the west side, is a lot there. There's a lot more there in terms of bigger houses, nicer houses, etc., moving into the western suburbs. You can kind of see the starting of Urbandale with like 7 streets, and Valley Junction and Clive starting to grow as well at this point in time. Our map was created in 1938. And so as we saw in the last slide, the D6 area, you can see this here. I'm trying to circle it, but this area then on the west side of this D6 neighborhood is where they saw the largest concentration of African Americans in that neighborhood. And when we think back to the demographic map from 2017, this is where we see a large portion of the concentration of African Americans as well today in the city of Des Moines. And so as I was talking about these racially restrictive covenants, you can see that this green area on the west side, the massive A1 green area, has kind of a buffer around it of these blue neighborhoods. And these blue neighborhoods were, they were essentially a buffer between those red and yellow neighborhoods, so they weren't close to the best areas of the city. But we do see that there are green areas that don't have any buffer around them. For instance, we have this neighborhood. You guys probably may know it. I mean, you probably will. It's Chautauqua Park. And Chautauqua Park, when it was being developed in the early 1910s, 1915, the developer put a racially restrictive covenant on the entire development. So the entire neighborhood was a whites-only neighborhood. This meant, again, that there would be no infiltration from the adverse influential groups. And so because this, in 1938, it was a whites-only neighborhood, meaning that there wouldn't be that fear of infiltration, and so it was given a green rating. And just south of it, that was an area that had a larger concentration of those adverse influential groups that I talked about. And so over time, we even see today when you go to Chautauqua Park compared to the neighborhood just south of it, that you can tell that more investment has been put into Chautauqua Park over the decades than the neighborhood just south, or the neighborhoods just south of it. And so it continues to be present today, even when you just drive through it, even though it's not a whites-only neighborhood today, because it was labeled that back in 1938 and was scheduled for more investment as time went on. You can still see the big difference geographically that it created. And then also we see over here by Union Park, there's an A3 area, and over by Grandview Park as well, where there were larger developments of housing on these blocks that were racially restrictive and given those green ratings. And so as we move on, I talked that 239 cities were given these maps. Of course, that's not all maps across, or not all cities across the United States, but that didn't mean that redlining or this system didn't hit everywhere across the United States. If you didn't have a redlining map, then the Federal Housing Administration had this underwriting manual that was passed out to lenders and as well as to cities, city officials across the United States, no matter the size of your community. And it essentially took the maps and what it was producing and implementing into a book form, and essentially told lenders and cities to look out for hazardous populations and to prefer areas that had restrictions on infiltration, or to make sure that there were areas that had restrictions on infiltration if they didn't already have it, to make sure that it would help the real estate values in their community and make sure that those real estate values stayed and didn't decrease because of the adverse influential groups. And so I've talked a lot about the federal government pushing this system on a financial, the mortgage lending side of it. However, it can't be ignored that the private industry of real estate was also playing a big part in pushing this system on a local level. And we have just a little paragraph from a 1922 National Association of Real Estate Brokers textbook. And we know that the language that I'll read was used all the way up until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was put into effect. But it reads that the colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But they must recognize the economic disturbance which their presence in a white neighborhood causes and forego their desire to split off from the established district where the rest of their race lives. So essentially, this was something that you'd have to know on your test and to know like the back of your hand going out into the work world, into the real estate world, and understanding that, you know, if you had an African-American family that was looking for a place to rent, or if they had the means, a place to buy, then you made sure that they lived in an area that was where their race lived and where it was determined where their race should live, and not have any other options to move anywhere else. So real estate did play a big role in making sure that this was implemented and successfully during this time, and all the way up until the 60s as well. And so as we move on, we'll get more into the timeline, but you can see that this image, it spans from era 1 to era 4 with redlining and what we've been talking about, the New Deal era programs, the Homeowners Loan Corporation is all in the beginning of era 2 in the 1930s and 40s. But we can't start this conversation or end that conversation in that period of time. We start back in era 1, which we start in 1800, so with slavery, and going all the way to present day in era 4. And so we won't focus a lot of our time on this. As Lauren mentioned at the beginning, we're really focusing on understanding the impact that it's had on the city of Des Moines and on Iowa specifically. But a lot of the information that you see and topics that you see on these timelines, it just really shows that it's a cycle that has continued for decades and has really just continued to embed itself into our society and into our geography and into our cities and how they're built. And so as we get into the Iowa portion, when looking at the early years in Iowa and also just across the United States, we go back to the Reconstruction years, but even before in the 1800s with slavery and into the 1840s, we start to see the rise of scientific racism occurring in the academic world, especially in places like Harvard, putting a lot of brain power and understanding and coming up with the concept of scientific racism, which then grows into the eugenics movement, which is thrown across the entire world, which then influences the racial terrorism that rises in the South in 1865 with the creation of the KKK. And so We also have at this point in time the end of the Civil War in 1864, and in 1863 we have the Emancipation Proclamation. So we're getting to a point where there are a lot of, especially we have a lot of freed slaves at the end of the Civil War, at the start of Reconstruction, with a lot of racial terrorism starting and a lot of people fleeing north into the northern states. And so Iowa is one of those northern states, and we had a lot of abolitionist movement as well in the southern part of the state during and before the Civil War. But in 1851, which is just after, really a little after Iowa even became a state and became part of the Union, the Iowa legislature enacted an exclusionary law, which essentially meant that no free Negro or mulatto would be able to settle in the state of Iowa. So it's excluding them. But if you already did live in the state, then you'd have to prove that you were actually free in front of a judge, and that you'd have to pay a bond of $500 to say that you won't be a public charge to the state of Iowa. And so this was really hard to enforce in the state because of a lot of that abolitionist movement, but also it's a pretty large state, and it was just really hard to enforce at a local level. And by the time the end of the Civil War came around, it was taken out of state law. But with these images, before I move on, just some examples, not just from the early years, but you have the bottom picture, which is showing the Great Migration, which is in the beginning of the 1900s into, really starting about 1917 when the Great Migration is really taking effect. But these are people going on the Illinois Central line, going up to places like Chicago, but passing through Iowa, and some people stay. As well as there's a poster there of a KKK event looking at a spectacular parade in the city of Des Moines with a picnic at the state fairs and bands and concerts and all this stuff. And really it was seen as a very big event, right? And these conclaves were a really big part of even the Des Moines history with white supremacy. And we're going to move into the 1900s, specifically into 1910 to 1920, right before we get into redlining. But I've already talked a lot about racially restrictive covenants in segregated neighborhoods being influenced and being implemented as part of redlining. But it was happening before redlining was put into effect. We have two images here from the Des Moines Tribune and Des Moines Register between 1912 and 1916, I believe. And it's just two examples that these are massive advertisements in the newspapers for selling of plots of land in the city, and that they specifically are saying that we will not sell, and we cannot sell to colored people in this tract or in this area. So even the selling of property in the beginning in the early 1900s is already being restrictive by race. And between 1910 and 1920, we see in Polk County that the African American population increases by 62%, which is a very large increase, especially in a very white area of the United States. And you can see those numbers of the actual numbers of African Americans that it increased. But this even helped to spur more of that restriction against these adverse influential group that they didn't want to invade their community. And so these racially restrictive covenants and deeds at a local level were really effective. And as the government started to create the system of redlining, they looked at how effective these restrictions were from the 1910s and 1920s and used it to help propel their development, or to help propel their system that was created to segregate parts of the city, so that those restrictions were really, really effective. And we're going to skip over to the 1950s, as we've already talked about redlining. But in the 1950s, this is an image from the Des Moines Tribune, I believe, or it might be the Des Moines Register. But it shows that in 1950 where African Americans lived in the city of Des Moines. And you can see, obviously, the darker areas with the higher numbers, that's where you have the concentration. Again, thinking about even today, where the concentration, we still see a lot of similar areas. But the article is looking at really how segregation was almost 100% complete in the city of Des Moines by this point in time. And when we look at the other census tracts, you can see that there are some that have like 1 or maybe 2. But what the article talks about is that it's not that one person that was African American lived in that neighborhood, but it was mostly that they were live-in help for a white family. And so it's just very interesting to look at the different areas to see where the African Americans lived in the city of Des Moines in 1950. And as we move into, we're kind of speeding through the timeline, but as we move into the 1960s and 1970s, this is really when urban renewal is occurring across the United States, more housing discrimination, as well as slum clearance, which comes along with the creation of freeways throughout the United States. And so it's really, slum clearance is essentially the clearing of slums that the cities saw were poor parts of the city that they didn't want anymore, and they wanted to clear them out. And so with this, they started urban renewal, figuring out what to replace those areas with. And a lot of activists and African-American communities call it Negro removal, not urban renewal, because across the United States, about 72% of people displaced were people of color. And so we see that here in the city of Des Moines. We had 2 major urban renewal areas, the Oak Ridge Renewal Area and the River Hills Urban Renewal Area, which then has I-235 that cuts right through the middle of them. All these happening within the same time frame. About almost 1,300 families were displaced as part of all of these projects going on. In the River Hills Renewal Area specifically, half of the households displaced had African American heads of households. So a large portion of that population was African American that was displaced. And then also this quote really gives you an idea that I'll briefly talk about right after, but it states that one family said that we were paid only $5,500 for our 3-bedroom home, and now are forced to buy a 2-bedroom house that's not as good for $9,500. And we see that this occurring in a lot of other documents that we continue to read. And a lot of African Americans didn't receive the same amount of money from the government that white families did, even if they had pretty much the same home. And also African Americans, because of racially restrictive covenants and racially restrictive deeds, and just general discrimination and racism, did not have the ability to move to other parts of the city where white families did have that opportunity. And so then we start to see areas where, just like that family's quote says, you know, they have to move to areas where the housing is not as good and is smaller, and they're having to pay outrageous prices for these properties. And this also then changes because then people can't afford to buy a home, so then people have to start renting from landlords who are increasing the property prices and renting prices because of the color of their skin. We see this happening across the city of Des Moines. And just to give you an example and just a timeline of the freeway construction, here's 1950. You can see that most of the area here is residential, and you then move into 1960 while the freeway is in construction. You can see the large portions that are being bulldozed for all the entrances and exits from the freeways and all the bridges and etc. And then by 1970, you see the full extent of what land was taken away. And also you see even in the bottom right-hand corner of the 1970 map compared to the 1950 map, that whole area was part of the Oak Ridge Renewal area. And so that was all made, all of that was completely, this whole section here was then completely destroyed to create parking lots and those types of things as well. And just to give you an example of what was being produced in the media at the point in time of this urban renewal happening, these are just some images from an article from the Des Moines Tribune that looks at what they wanted to have as their urban renewal project. And you can see that in this image, there's been a lot of demolition already happening, especially north of the freeway. And a lot of the projects that they wanted to accomplish did not happen the way that it was put out in this article, but they still demolished a lot of property in the process. And when we look at, we were really fortunate to be able to find this and have the city of Des Moines put this actually in an article, but it shows the relocation of the River Hills area residents. And so you can see here, I'm just gonna get my laser pointer up, but you can see here's the River Hills renewal area. And then right next to it's the Oak Ridge renewal area. And you can see that a lot of the residents didn't move far away from where they were displaced. But a lot also moved into the Oak Ridge renewal area, which means that they were then displaced another time because the Oak Ridge area came after the River Hills renewal area. And so when we look at this, you can see that there are two different types of circles, one with a dot in the middle and one without. The one without are African-American families, and the one with the dots in the middle are white families, white households. And you can see that the ones with the dots in the middle move all across the city. However, when you look for the circles without the dots, they don't move as far because they don't have the ability to. And so as we move then into understanding, you know, what this destruction actually meant for the African-American population in the city of Des Moines, we really need to focus on one of the big hub of the community, which was Center Street. Center Street was known in Des Moines as Black Wall Street. It was the center of the African-American economy here in the city of Des Moines. It was Black-owned businesses. For a few blocks up and down Black-owned businesses, jazz clubs, grocery stores, funeral homes, social clubs, barber shops, etc. Every business you could think of was there, and they were all Black-owned. It was the center of the community, and it was enjoyed by everyone in the city, not just African Americans. And especially those jazz clubs and social clubs brought people from across the United States, jazz musicians from across the United States and opera singers to come to the city of Des Moines to perform at these clubs. And all of it was completely destroyed as part of the Oak Ridge Renewal Project and the freeway. And so when we think about today, you know, where's Center Street? Center Street still does exist. There are portions of it that run through our city, but a lot of it has been cut off or redeveloped into things like post offices and larger business buildings. And also a large portion of the Center Street neighborhood is now the Methodist parking lot. And also one portion is a ramp that goes off of the freeway. So it was completely taken away and never able to recover. A lot of the businesses financially couldn't buy another building or really start up anywhere else, or really had to move to other parts of Iowa to be able to run their businesses. So it completely destroyed that, and it hasn't been able to recover even still to this day. And so then we move still in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, but mostly in the 60s and 70s, we really see the rise of the white suburbs that were being funded since after World War II, a lot of money being put into the development of the suburbs. This image, of course, is not the city of Des Moines or the metro. It is Levittown, Pennsylvania, which is one of the biggest suburban communities that was one of the first developed in the country, and is taught a lot. But when we look at the rise of the white suburbs, one of the biggest things that we talk about is white flight. And realtors were essentially going in, and real estate speculators going in and convincing white families that their properties were going to devalue as more African Americans moved into their neighborhoods. And so the fear pushed white families to move out of the inner ring neighborhoods and into the newly developed suburban communities that were white. And what a lot of people don't know is that the Federal Housing Administration actually had a requirement for white-only suburbs. To be able to even receive federal loans, builders had to build on the explicit condition that the homes would be not sold to Black home buyers. So if you wanted federal funding to build in the suburbs, then you had to make sure that your properties would not be sold to Black home buyers. So it was very, very explicit on that financial side again. And then at the same time, even while public housing had been being built in cities since the 1940s, in the 1960s and 70s, as more public housing is being built, even though originally it was really for middle-class white families, we start to see that these public housing units start to become increasingly concentrated with minorities, and especially poorer families and poor families of color, as white families move out to the suburbs. And so just to give you an idea about the impact that specifically had in the city of Des Moines, we have this quote from the City of Des Moines Commission on Human Rights from 1961. And it reads, "Negroes have been almost totally excluded from the purchase or rental of the 15,379 homes built by private enterprise since World War II. At this writing, no builder will sell a Negro house in any development now in progress. 86% of all Negro households in Des Moines are located in our most rundown sections of our city." So, as you can see in the city of Des Moines, this was playing out very well in the city of Des Moines, and making sure that any new developments that were taking place would not be sold or even rented to African American families. And just to briefly talk about, I've talked a lot about the federal policy and the local policy and private industry and the impact of all of these policies. But also, we can't forget that there was a lot of community response happening against these policies that were being implemented specifically on African Americans. And so these are just a few examples that we just want to show specifically from Des Moines. In 1948, we have one of the biggest civil rights lawsuits in the city of Des Moines with Edna Griffin and a few of her daughter and a few others that were refused dining service at Katz Drugstore, which was in downtown Des Moines. And they had a lot of protests. You can see that image there of people protesting Katz drugstores on the street with signs. And this went on for a few years, but eventually Edna Griffin won the case. So that was a really big positive for the civil rights movement here in the city of Des Moines. And then also we have the Black Panthers of Des Moines, which played a big role in implementing a lot of different programs that we still see today in the city of Des Moines. But some of their victories that we point out on the bottom there, included pushing the city to hire more African Americans, to make sure that Black history is being taught in high schools, and to also expand the capacity of schools that were being attended by Black students. And one of the biggest ones really was making sure that the Des Moines Police Department was treating Black suspects and prisoners with respect and with rights. And so they did play a really big role in making sure that civil rights was still happening in the city of Des Moines. That was really in the 1970s that this occurred. And then the last thing, the NAACP specifically leading housing activism in the city of Des Moines during urban renewal, and really protesting those lofty prices that I talked about and the discrimination that was happening when people are trying to be relocated. And then also just lastly on this page, in the bottom left-hand side of the screen, you can see an image of 5 young men. And we just think that this picture speaks loudly on this topic, because these 5 young men are essentially walking across their neighborhood that was destroyed and demolished. And you can see that this is really where the Oak Ridge Housing Project was going to be starting to be put into place. And they were just walking and looking at the neighborhood that had changed, and that their neighborhood that had been demolished. So I think it's just a great visual. And then on the 4th part of our exhibit that comes after the timeline, we really want to make sure that people are hearing stories from the community and the impact that it has had. All these different policies have had, especially on the African American community. So Lauren's going to play just a little snippet of an audio interview that we had with Joyce Bruce about 4 or 5 months ago. And it's the middle kind of paragraph there if you want to follow along as she talks, but she's one of our community advisory members. And so, yeah.
But this did not occur until after Grandma Clark had passed. She had passed. Okay. And I never understood the reason why, but we moved down to Stewart Street. And I didn't learn until later that the reason why we moved was because Eastside built a stadium. They took our land. They took our land. They took the grocery store. The Harrises lived there. They had a grocery store. They took the community center. They just wiped that whole block completely out, all the way down. And people just moved everywhere. And when the family moved on to Stewart Street, it was like we just didn't have that family closeness where everybody supported one another. We moved into this little teeny tiny house, which was completely different after having this large house on Buchanan Street. And I had a hard time adjusting to it, because I'm going, why is the bathroom off the kitchen? Don't make sense. It didn't make sense to me. And my mother did not like the house, and she basically stayed in her bedroom. And the boys had to share a room, and I had to share a room with the girls, because there was only 3 bedrooms. We didn't have 5 bedrooms like in the other house. But
Oh, Kendall, I think
I'm
you're
muted.
on mute. Oh, there we go.
I was muted. But thanks. And that just gives a snippet, of what people actually went through in their personal experiences. And you can go to our website and listen to a few more audio interviews, as well as some jazz-specific, Center Street-specific videos that were done as well, to get some more of that personal experience. But as we move into the last era of the timeline, really looking at present day, we really are seeing for the first time since the 1930s, neighborhoods that were once redlined being primed for investment. And a lot of this is because they're inner ring neighborhoods, and now people are really wanting to be close to downtowns again and have access to all the amenities that come with living close to downtowns, especially with walkability and being close to, theaters and restaurants and that lifestyle. And so across the US, we even see that here, not at a scale in places like New York City or Chicago, but we do see it at a small scale here still in the city of Des Moines, and places like the East Village as kind of one of the prime examples, where once was the Redline neighborhood. For a very long time, up to even just 5 years ago, had a lot of affordable housing that was still there, and is now really been redeveloped into having luxury condos and higher market rate apartments, and higher end stores that are being put in there as well. So really, you know, becoming one of those gentrified areas. Gentrification is a tricky word to use because it has a lot of different meanings in a lot of different scenarios. But essentially what we start to see is that people are being priced out of their neighborhoods that they've been in for a very long time, or even if they're not being priced out, that they're being disconnected from their, like that family closeness that Joyce was talking about. They're being separated from those connections, and so they move as well. So we start to see that. And then also we started to see since the 1970s that there's a lot of financial insecurity that is becoming a more common experience for American families. And that we're really seeing that the city's vulnerable residents are encountering affordability crisis. We all see that, and this COVID-19 situation is even making it more apparent, right? And when we look specifically at Polk County and Dallas County, we see that 44% of our residents are rent burdened. It might be even higher. We're still trying to figure out the data right now, but it might be even higher than that today. And after this crisis, it may be even higher, right? And so when we're even looking at just the supply to the demand of housing in our region, you know, we see in Polk County that there's only 30 units per 100 families that are in need of housing in Polk County. That is affordable. And so the supply has not kept up with the demand, and we still see that trend continuing. And so as we wrap up here, you know, where do we go from here? And in the last section of the exhibit, it really focuses on how do we start to undesign the red line. And Designing the firm that created the base exhibit, came up with 3 areas that they really think are ways to start this process of redesigning. The first one is how do you reframe the conversation and the narrative behind, you know, why do I think that a certain neighborhood looks the way it does? What are my own personal biases? What did I learn growing up? And having that understanding about where we come up with our own ideas and our perceptions about why our city looks the way it does, for example. And then starting to reframe that narrative by, you know, having a presentation like this and understanding the history and the facts behind why certain areas of our city look the way they do. It's not because people don't care about their property, but, you know, it's because 70% of them are renters, which means they have landlords who then the landlords are supposed to be taking care of the property, right? So there's a lot of different things to look in there, but also it's just having conversations with people who have a different experience than you and have a different background, and getting a more wholesome look at the narrative and understanding different people's perspectives to get that reframing. And then the second thing is then how do we start to redesign our collaboration process, our decision-making process, any process that's going to impact our community at any level. And so really the redesign there is making sure that people who are going to be impacted by a decision or development, that they have their voices heard and are part of the process, and making sure that what's being changed in their neighborhood isn't going to negatively affect most of the people that are living there, right? And having voices heard and just being involved in that process and having a real collaborative community engagement process. And then the last thing is looking at how do we then reinvest in our communities, and specifically into those communities, those redline communities that have been the target of wealth destruction for generations, and have been the neighborhoods that have been targeted for disinvestment for decades that really haven't seen that investment. And so how do we start to do that to make sure that, you know, it's our first community question there, is then how do we start to bring investment into a community that connects and builds wealth broadly with communities and heals the wealth destruction? And then also, how do we involve everyone in that problem solving of these issues from the ground up, and making sure everyone's involved. And then just the last thing to leave you with before we get into questions, you know, if our solutions don't affirmatively mitigate past injustices, then they're most likely exacerbating them. And a lot of this is because the system that was created and implemented is so embedded into our society and into how cities make decisions about where things go, especially that, you know, there needs to be a wrench put in the gears, and needs to be some thought put in around this that's going to be positive for our community. And so with that, anybody have any questions? If also, we have a website there that you guys can visit. Of course, there's a lot of resources that talks about current housing discrimination, as well as information about redlining just generally and the history of it nationally. And just, yeah, videos, audio files, just a bunch of different information if you want to learn more.
I would think Jason might have a question or a comment.
Yeah, I don't know that I have any questions really. I mean, this is something that I've been passionate about kind of since I became a realtor, but also in personal life as well. Things that I actually just applied to be in the Greater Des Moines Leadership Institute program, and this issue was what I put as our #1 need to change in Des Moines. So, I mean, just really informative stuff. I really appreciate the walkthrough of it. I can't, like I said, it's something that I'm passionate about, so I don't know that I necessarily have specific questions, but I know that I would love to see this become required education for realtors as opposed to the 10 minutes or less we get about it in our real estate classes. I mean, the fact that even just, and we all have lives and we're all busy. I'm not trying to speak negatively of anyone, but the fact that we have 7 participants on this webinar, with 2 of them being you guys, and we have 200 plus in our company that we're all like, you know, this afternoon, redlining isn't important to me. And I think that agents very, very frequently break the law in saying, oh, you don't want to live here because of XYZ reasons that are just outlined, you know, in your presentation. So I live in the Drake neighborhood. I work a lot in old neighborhoods, and so often I get, oh yeah, we love old houses. We want to live in an old house, but definitely not Drake. And it's always nice to be able to respond with, well, I live in the Drake neighborhood. What's wrong with it?
Yes.
And if they won't tell you the reason, you have your answer.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've definitely had a few people who've come through the tour, and, you know, say, yeah, I remember when I moved to the city of Des Moines, I wanted to live, you know, in a specific neighborhood, and they were told, you know, you shouldn't live here, the schools are bad, you know, there's too much crime, and, you know, all these things that aren't necessary talking about race, but on a historical level, they're the areas that, you know, those are the areas that are seen as the worst parts of the worst parts of the city, or places you shouldn't be buying a home. Right?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I have experienced that recently as well. So I'm actually in the market for a home, and you know, it's funny. You know, you'll look at some in Des Moines, and then take a look at one out in West Des Moines, and start to hear some of that come out, such as, you know, this will be a lot better for resale because the schools are a lot better, or there's not as much crime and things like that. So interesting.
Thing
After
is people, people say a lot of that, but it's also, quite frankly, not true. I mean, Roosevelt is one of the best schools in the state of Iowa, but
Right.
Very true.
Heather, I saw your question in the chat. As far as how I act on it is, I guess, you know, I can't tell people where to live, but I definitely strive to encourage people to check out neighborhoods and constantly reassure them all of the positive things happening, like kind of where I live and things like that. As far as how I would act on it in the future, well, part of my goals with being informed and more involved is to potentially be one of the policymakers someday when my kids are much older. So maybe get back to you in 10 years or so on my true action.
Well, and there's so much more that can go with the conversation. I know Kendall and I talked for, gosh, probably an hour after I went to the exhibit in person, and things that you don't think about, like that Italian and what was it? Italian and Irish were not considered white until, gosh, I don't even remember what year.
Yeah, it was until like 1945, 46.
Yeah, things like that. And then in the areas that were those redlined areas, I mean, even city services were taken away. So when there were budget issues, city services like police and fire and even trash removal were taken out of those areas, and so that the other areas could have better service. It's just, it's mind-boggling I think at this point for some of us.
Well, and you can see some of that even in what wouldn't be considered low-income activities, in the fact that, you know, so we're members at Wakanda, and I grew up going to Echo Valley because that's where my parents are members. And I didn't know this at Echo Valley, but once I became a member at Wakanda, I actually learned that Echo Valley, part of its development was, and this could be hearsay, but that Wakanda didn't allow Italians. And so Italians said, we're going to build our own golf course then.
That's interesting. There's actually some interesting history regarding kind of block busting in Wakanda, and specifically with the Wakanda Christian Church over there on Fleur. So their pastor, and I wish I had it in front of me, was, you know, basically said he, you know, thought on it and consulted his faith, and that led him to the belief that there shouldn't be any issue with African American families moving into Wakanda Manor, specifically, and that church is very, very proud of that history that they have, because this was right at the inception of right after the church was built, and so they were some of the first folks to really come out in support of integration in neighborhoods in Des Moines. And so it's a really cool story. So we have about 4 pages that he wrote, basically outlining his thinking and why he landed on the issue in the way he did. It's you know, that it's the little silver lining. It's so much of this information can kind of bog you down in a certain way, and it's encouraging to see that there were folks in our community, similar to the community response stories that Kendall shared, but it's encouraging to see that there were folks in the community who were progressive enough to, you know, see the issue for what it was.
Yeah.
How many people have you guys had through the exhibit? Do you have a number?
We don't have a count. But in that, I guess it was about 2.5 months, or just about 2 months maybe, that it was open, and we had well over 1,000 people through the exhibit itself. And then since providing it online, Kendall, how many people do you think we've had? Because we've had some groups that are almost 100 people in them, and we're expecting one of those in May, or maybe even a couple. We're going to be doing one for the joint meeting between the Civil and Human Rights Commission and City Council in Des Moines on May 14th, and then one for members of the Greater Des Moines Partnership on May 13th. And
as well as next
as
Tuesday.
of now, over 100 people have,
Yeah. And next Tuesday too, as well, we are the APA Iowa. So all planners, I'm a planner, so, but we're doing a big event for the American Planning Association Iowa Division next Tuesday too. So we've had a lot, I would say that, and we've had a lot of our public tours have about 20 people that sign up, which is great. And sometimes there's more than one face on the other side. So it's even hitting more people. And last week we actually had a woman who watched it for a second time, but the second time with her husband. And they actually created another Zoom call with friends of theirs that had been to the exhibit or seen the exhibit and had their own wine and cheese talk about Undesign the Redline evening. So it's like creating these conversations that even just for people wanting to know more and understand how they can use this knowledge to create more conversation around it, which is really positive.
When I think that having the knowledge of it is, how do I want to say it, really the only way that you address it.
Right.
Because a lot of people think, oh, well, they don't like the neighborhood, just go buy a house over here, or, whatever. And it's, what do you guys see as action items for, obviously we're realtors. I saw obviously in the presentation, what the action needs to, the thought process of the action,
right.
But what about actual action?
Yeah, that's
hard question. I know. If we had the answer,
question.
It wouldn't exist anymore, but.
Right. And, we obviously know that action needs to take place. But a lot of what we've focused on so far is just the re-education because so many people, no matter what field they're in, or just generally want to know, it's just people don't know about it or don't think it even happened here. And so just getting people aware of this history and the actual impact that it has, that you can actually see when you go drive around the city of Des Moines today, and understanding, well, why do you that comment of I don't want to buy in this neighborhood because it's a rundown neighborhood, and having the understanding of, well, not having that stereotypical view of, oh, it's run down because the property owners don't care about their property, right? And it's like low income, so that's why. But really understanding, why it does, and that it's been disinvested in, and having that knowledge, because then once we have, I don't want to say everybody on the same page because that'll never happen. But once we have a large group of people that actually understand the historical context, then we're able to change that narrative, which then allows us to actually think about action items that could be possible. And so that's why, like, the joint meeting between the Human Civil Rights Commission and City Council is so important, because those are our decision makers in our community, and the people who have the power to make change. And so that's why it's so, we're really happy that they still wanted to have us and to make sure that this is something that is being talked about. And a lot of it too is that we've had people who have come through the exhibit that are calling their council member and telling them how important this is, which has been awesome to hear, because then that's an action that just people are taking on their own accord to, reach out to the people that they know are the ones who are going to be making decisions for the city, and telling them that this is important and should be discussed. So there aren't specific action items right now, at least that we've, written up or anything. But I think that what just generally, if we're looking at the real estate world in just general, is that, a lot of housing discrimination still occurs on a regular basis. People still do things based on race or how people sound on the phone, you know, making assumptions about people, and that they should, you know, saying that this house is already rented when it might not be, right? We see this happening all the time, and just making it clear that, you know, when you're going out, not doing those things is a great step. And, you know, if you do, I always think, you know, if you do see a colleague or, you know, hear of something, to, I don't know, not like call people out, but, you know, just reinforce the not being discriminatory, because one, it's against the law, but also just because it's right, it's wrong, and that people should be able to choose where they live, not based on what they look like or how much, you know, not necessarily how much money they have, or, you know, and Lauren and I have been working on the workforce housing study for the region, and looking at, you know, making sure that when we are building housing, that affordable housing specifically, but workforce housing, now what we're calling it, is built around the region close to business centers. And so that everybody, no matter their economic status, has the ability to buy in places like West Des Moines, or, you know, live in Clive, or, you know, Ankeny if they want, you know. So it's like having the ability to have the choice, and not be told that you shouldn't live somewhere just because of these different reasons, which is discriminatory. So,
yeah, and a lot of our work with that workforce housing study, and now kind of moving into the planning process of it, is not only ensuring that folks have the opportunity to live in different places, but more importantly, that the supply is there. Mm-hmm. Right? So that we're building for all income levels, because as you guys probably very well know, you know, in the past 5-10 years, most of the new construction in the metro has, besides, you know, excluding multifamily, so most of the single family new construction has been above that $300,000 price point. That's actually starting to change. Like I said, been in the market for a house, so I've kind of seen some new stuff coming up recently. But we are really working to ensure that as much as they can, developers are building homes that are more affordable, starter homes that are more affordable to just kind of middle income families. And do just want to point out, it's on our website, not the Undesign website, but a website, our trust fund website, PCHTF.org. We have a down payment assistance program that's actually, the money's going pretty fast now. But basically this program for folks that qualify based upon their income level, that it's sponsored by Prairie Meadows. So it's a Prairie Meadows Polk County Housing Trust Fund down payment assistance program, and up to $15,000. This program will match a down payment on a home, new construction. Basically, it's the sole purpose of it is to encourage developers to build more homes at that price, knowing that, you know, they can get folks into them pretty easily. But just wanted to make you guys aware of that program. So it's at PCHTF.org. There's a sidebar on the left and it says down payment assistance program, and there's more information about that. But I guess that was a little maybe veered a little far there, but going back to the point that, you know, our key initiative is just making sure that folks have the opportunities to live where they choose to live.
Heather, you got something, right? I watched you start talking a couple times.
I know, yeah.
So, Lauren, could you put the website that you just said in the chat?
Right here.
So we
I'll do it.
Yes, I can.
And I'm
Here, and
curious I'm curious how old that program is, because I did a bunch of down payment assistance research, like maybe in January, and I even spoke to somebody about Polk County housing, and all they had at that time was basically like builder developer assistance. So
yeah, so this is and I just dropped in the link to the down payment program. Sure. So I believe, I mean, it's funny because in the past month is when it's really kind of started flying off the shelves. But I believe we started it either last fall or in this, early winter of this year. But I don't think that I just don't think it was quite public knowledge enough at that point, because at that time we were kind of working with the developers in particular. So that might be where that interpretation came from. We were working with the developers initially because we thought that would probably be the best way to I don't know, facilitate it. But since then we've kind of broadened that so that we will really work with anyone to make sure the money gets in the right hands. But it's been a great program so far. And I think at first probably folks were a little bit apprehensive about it too and didn't really understand how it worked. And so hopefully the site I just sent you explains it in a little bit more detail. Great.
So then my other question was to Jason, as somebody else who sells real estate. So of course, you're not going to say, well, you shouldn't live here because you're white and this neighborhood is black. Like we don't do that. We know that. For example, last night I was showing a house in an East Side neighborhood. I don't know. Actually, the people that I saw in the yards and whatever were white. So I don't think it was a race issue, but the houses were, it was not a well-off neighborhood. Like if you look around, there's a lot of roofs that are not just old, but roofs that are like fallen off or look like they've been burned. We've got some big problems. And so what I do when I'm showing houses is, okay, this house is great, but let's look at the neighbors. Are you sure that this is a neighborhood that you want to live in? Because Lauren, if you're thinking about buying, are you going to buy a house where the meth houses next door to you, but it's in a neighborhood that used to be redlined, so let's live there? I'm just struggling with what to do with this information, because I'm not sure that it really changes how I work with my clients, because of course I'm going to direct them to make decisions that are good for their future financial, as best we can predict. And so I was curious about Jason, how he handled that as well.
Yeah, I'm not telling people, oh, hey, just live here because, of course not.
You'll love it.
But like take Drake, for example, because I've been working with Invest ESM on Drake. I'm on the Drake neighborhood board. Then my chamber, I'm on the board. We're focusing on Drake this year. I'm trying to more focus on, hey, here's all of the things going on in this neighborhood. What I foresee is a lot of these homes being fixed up due to these reasons. Maybe you're getting something cheaper now that has the more space, and as the neighborhood grows around it, it is that smart financial decision.
Right.
Now, that's not to say there aren't streets or, sections of blocks, 3, 4, 5 blocks from my house where I'd be like, nope, not a chance I'm living there.
Right.
But, it's like one thing that Invest ESM is doing right now in the 4 pilot neighborhoods that's super cool is a Rock the Block challenge / grant program, where if you can get 10 homeowners to commit to doing some sort of exterior project, they will reimburse them up to $2,500. And so some of the things like on my block people are talking about are painting or gutters or removing or adding a fence or things like that. And so I think that the more that we have those programs, you can watch it happen. If you drive down like Sherman Hill, for example, if you drove around Sherman Hill 10 plus years ago, there might have been 2 or 3 houses painted up all pretty, but that's about it. Yeah. As a few people fixed up a few of those houses, look at Sherman Hill now. I had a house listed for $700,000 last year in Sherman Hill that they bought for $15,000 because it didn't have half of a foundation and there were holes in the wall and all of that stuff. But, there's been several things that have sold there. So I think it's not so much things that we can specifically do as realtors, in my opinion, other than encouraging people to check out the neighborhoods that their racist uncle told them to avoid. But, say, hey, I'm not saying you got to buy a house there, but why don't I include it in the search and you might see something that you like.
Right.
Now, this isn't going to pull in the people that want, a house, 10 years old or less, and all that. I'm not going to get them. But the fact that people are like, oh, I love old homes. I want to be in Beaverdale, Ingersoll Grand, South of Grand, Waterbury, definitely not Drake, no way.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I try to tell people is I'm like, well, do you realize that the Drake neighborhood is actually MLK to 42nd Street, 235 to just north of Forest? So a lot of people live in the Drake neighborhood and think they live in Waterbury, but that's a whole nother discussion. But yeah, so I mean, as far as I just encourage people, or I even had someone, actually she ended up River's daycare provider through, totally unrelated to this discussion. But when I originally helped her and her then husband, they were looking for homes. They were like, we want to live anywhere but Des Moines. And here's our budget. We were struggling. We saw a whole bunch of dumps in Altoona and Pleasant Hill and Valley Junction, and because definitely not Des Moines, definitely not Des Moines.
Right. Yeah.
And I said, well, guys, now that you're not finding anything, do me a favor, let me include Des Moines in your search. You can take a look at some houses there, and then if you don't see anything you want to see, fine. They found a house in like 2 weeks and lived in Des Moines. So
yeah.
And I also oftentimes, when people bring up the schools, I'm able to use my personal experience, because laws and such, we're not supposed to give our true not supposed to steer people to schools or give our opinions on schools, but I can say, well, hey, my son went to Greenwood, Callahan, Roosevelt, and we've had an amazing experience. And I know that there was a study, it's probably been 5+ years ago at this point, but that Roosevelt High School seniors performed the best in the state of Iowa in their first year of college. Personally, I find that to be a lot better metric than what some 5th and 8th graders do on standardized tests. That's what all the scores on the websites give you.
Yeah, but see, you work south of Franklin. I'm north of Franklin. Try in Vancouver.
Right. And so but I also only have experience with the schools that my kid has gone to. So any other school, I'm like, I'll mention maybe Central Campus and things that Des Moines offers that people don't realize, because that Central Campus program is absolutely insane, the number of things that they offer. You can do a marine biology degree where you actually go and study in the ocean with the animals. So, I mean, to say the school doesn't have opportunities is just crazy.
Right.
It's propaganda. It's just like, I always use the Drake comparison that, so if violence happens within 10 miles of Drake, it happened in the Drake neighborhood. Just like if a dog bites someone, they were probably a pit bull. We'll worry about the details later. And I find that to be, I've had conversations with people in the media about this, is that's part of the problem. As long as you continue to propagate the idea that everything bad happens in a certain location, Beaverdale has had as many or more murders than Drake in the past 3 years. And that's facts. And I wouldn't be surprised based on, but I also, it's partially because of that Facebook page, but it seems like Beaverdale has more crime than the Drake neighborhood too. But
That's what I've heard as well. Consider it Beaverdale.
What's that?
I wouldn't be surprised if people who live in Drake consider it Beaverdale.
Right. Oh, you'll definitely see that too.
Yeah.
Well, and if you really look at the map, Beaverdale likes to claim Snookies, but really it's at Drake, in the Drake neighborhood, if you truly look at the map. Drake goes to Franklin. The border
That's controversial.
And I think just to add on from kind of, I guess, my history perspective, but and just seeing that a lot of people, people are like, oh, Riverbend, I don't want to live there, or Cheatham Park, or these places that have been those areas that haven't been invested in, like places like Beaverdale, right? Are not necessarily something a realtor could change, right? Because you're not going to steer people one way or another. You just want to have people, have options, right? And see all the options that they're able to see. And like you said, Heather, you're not going to force someone to live in a once redline neighborhood, you know, if, you know, even if the house is great but they don't want their, you know, the neighbors and the surrounding is not maybe what they want. But I think part of that is also then, you know, going out and saying, you know, well, we see that there's this neighborhood that's great. It has a bunch of awesome houses. But also we see that there's no investment from the city even going into these neighborhoods. So it's not necessarily something that a realtor could, you know, fix, but it is something that we can then advocate for to the city and say, hey, you know, we see that a lot of money is going into places like better places of the city like Beaverdale, whereas, you know, there's this amazing part of the neighborhood in like Cheatham Park or something. I'm using those two as examples just because they're different. But just, you know, saying like maybe we should be putting more money into helping people update their roofs in Cheatham Park, or, you know, making sure that, you know, the sidewalks and the roads are more well taken care of, because then you're going to get more people wanting to move into those areas. And those are the areas where we see that they're lower property values, they're older homes. And then you'll have people like young people like me who might want to go, I live in Ames right now. So if like we end up moving to Des Moines, you know, I may want to live in that neighborhood and have the ability to buy that house because it's in my price range, and be able to fix up my house and have the ability to do that. And so like we've talked about, you know, Invest DSM is doing a lot of great things in a larger scope of trying to help this revitalization. But at the same time, you know, those 4 neighborhoods that were chosen were not the neighborhoods that haven't been invested in for 70 years, right? So it's like, we need to start looking at, well, maybe we should consider putting more money into those neighborhoods, because then you're gonna, you know, then those property values won't be 70,000. They could be closer to 140,000, right? If we continue to put investment in them. But we know that part of what Invest DSM is trying to do is to increase property values and property taxes. And doing that is by helping those already sound neighborhoods increase their property values. But then it's also creating a system where we're still leaving out those neighborhoods where there just hasn't been investment for a really long time. And that continues to happen. And again, those are still the areas that we see those higher concentrations of minorities and higher concentrations of poverty in our city. So trying to make sure that when we are making, you know, trying to, you know, we can't change it all on our own, right? Because we're not the decision makers of our communities. But trying to advocate for that and, you know, showing this history and the data and saying, you know, all that. Yeah.
So what happens when somebody invests in Cheatham Park? I don't even know where
Right.
that's at. Where is Cheatham Park?
Oh gosh, now I'm blanking.
No one knows. Okay, so let's say we start investing in Cheatham Park.
Right.
And then they're old houses, they're probably kind of
Right.
crappy and run down. So investors come in, they flip
Mhm.
them, they make them better.
Right.
Well, aren't you just doing the same thing that happened in, was it Riverbend and then Oak Ridge?
Right.
Those
Right.
people are displaced because tenants get out so I can make some
Yeah.
income on this property.
Right.
So it's
And
really just a vicious
that's
cycle
the
that keeps replaying.
exactly. And so that's part of like that third trying to undesign the red line is that third section of that. How do we reinvest into those communities so that we don't create gentrification essentially? And so allowing, because a lot of those areas that we see today where those specific areas that we showed on those maps that have lower property values and et cetera, a lot of those properties are renter properties. They're not home ownership. So providing the opportunity for the people who live there to get money, to like have grants, to put down payments on homes, instead of just saying, oh, okay, you know, we're going to put money so investors can come from the outside and come in and buy property there, but trying to make it so that we're able to create programs that allow people who already live in that community to gain access to funding and to grants to be able to buy property in that neighborhood, which is hard to do. We're not, I don't think, maybe I'm not going to speak for all of Polk County Housing Trust Fund, but from my perspective, we're not trying to say that no investor should come into these neighborhoods. But at the same time, it shouldn't be all investors coming into these and, large companies coming in and flipping like 10 homes and then selling them at larger quantities because they put in granite countertops that weren't there before, like all the little amenities or an extra bathroom, right? And then selling them at really high prices, which are then causing people who live in those neighborhoods to then maybe not be able to pay their own property taxes because now they're assessed higher. All these different things that happen with that. So it's trying to keep a balance, right, between making sure that we allow people the opportunity, and especially because there are so many people that just can't afford to buy a home no matter where they live, but having those down payment opportunities or other loan programs.
People who live in that neighborhood, because that's where they can afford to rent. If
right.
they had down payment assistance, would they choose to stay in that neighborhood and become a homeowner?
Right. And even if they don't, they then have the opportunity to move somewhere else, but then that allows then for more opportunity that if someone does want to live in that neighborhood, then they have the option to. Whereas, and part of this too is then because it's like 60% rentership, you have that issue of then dealing with the landlords and understanding, if you're going to be a landlord, you have to, like not telling people what to do, but, allowing landlords to have money to do upgrades on their, on their apartments or on their buildings that maybe they don't have the ability to.
Very tricky job you guys have.
Yeah.
And then I know the city of Des Moines and kind of on their Blitz on Blight has a huge push towards actually enforcing our rental codes, because some of the problem becomes that even if just because you're a renter doesn't mean you don't have rights and shouldn't live in squalor.
Right.
And that's why rental codes exist. But for so long, it's look the other way or slip me $50 under the table or whatever, that a lot of these property owners have gotten away with letting their properties just go to garbage. And but ultimately I think part of the problem is that that redlining may have originally been a lot of the cause for a lot of things by isolating people and keeping them a bit, but now it almost becomes a symptom of the cause of income inequality. And so you can't just address housing without addressing the racial disparities in what people make. You can't just say, oh, I want people to be able to buy something better, but if an African American is making $1 to every $3 that a white man makes, it's not white man or woman, sorry, but it's not I view this as an issue I'm passionate about by more spreading awareness and talking about it. And also, so often I explain to people, I'm like, do you know where suburbs started and how they started? Because a lot of people don't realize that the whole reason suburbs exist are because people are racist as hell. That is literally why they started. And so it's something where I feel like by just, talking about it and, just like the exhibit does, but just making people aware of it, you're not going to fix it. Until you fix financial inequality, you're not going to fix the after effects of redlining.
Right.
It's just not going to happen. You can't be like, oh, hello, Mr. African American, I want you to buy a nicer house because you're an African American. Well, I don't make any money. Well, I don't care. I'm trying to fight redlining. You need to buy a nicer house.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work.
Exactly. Yeah. It's that the education is so important because it's such a big shift from what society has taught for so long.
I think you're seeing some changes too. The Drake neighborhood specifically, I know I keep going to it, but I'm very involved in it. It has one of the fastest appreciating property values in the entire city of Des Moines, if not the fastest for Des Moines proper. That was per Invest DSM, I got that. But so you're really seeing a lot of people invest. And then even just south of Drake in Woodland Heights, you know, you have people like Rally Cap Properties that have done a ton of, now, yeah, they're selling their things for more expensive, but when the person lived next door to a rundown house and their house was run down, and then the house next door becomes right off of Pinterest, they're like, oh man, you know, I have pride in my home, but my whole street was a dump. Now that my street is getting nicer, I want to make my house look nicer. And then going back to your same thing, Heather, okay, now when that person sits on the front porch and looks around, they're like, oh yeah, you know, we drove through a couple bad streets, but this 2-block radius looks great. Like, yeah, I could live here. You know, and so there's that. But then I think you're seeing the city take action too with things like the 6th Avenue corridor. I think that'll really help in that neighborhood with some pride. And then the things they're doing on Douglas Avenue, combined with Invest DSM. And then also, I know Invest DSM isn't in the true, like the neighborhoods like you talked about, but I think having it in Highland and Oak Park and Drake to start, you know, because with the way their program is, they need people that are already either living there or looking there to be willing to invest their own money and be matched or things like that.
Definitely.
So I think that's why you had to do it in kind of an in-between neighborhood as opposed to, but I think when you look at the location of Highland and Oak Park and the location of Drake Park, well, King Irving sits right in between that. And as those neighborhoods develop and get nicer, you know, it grows. It's just like, you know, now, I mean, look at Beaverdale. Merle Hay is Beaverdale now. Because Beaverdale is not that big, and so people are kind of stretching that neighborhood and fixing out more and more houses in that. What, you know, Merle Hay wasn't necessarily a great neighborhood all that long.
And I think part of it too is that, you know, there are a lot of great things going on in neighborhood reinvestment and revitalization in the city of Des Moines, and I think part of it is just making sure that the city, as well as just people that are wanting to update their homes or, you know, be involved in Invest DSM, just making sure that people are aware that there are sometimes unintended consequences to doing these things, and that people should be, you know, it's that awareness, right? That education of understanding that there are unintended consequences that could potentially come from it. So for instance, maybe if someone updated their home, you know, that Pinterest home you were talking about, you know, and their next door neighbor, you know, is like, oh, I want, you know, I see that now my block is getting better and I want to redo it, but maybe they're not done paying their mortgage and now the price of what they pay per month increases, and their taxes increase, and now they have to move because they can't pay it anymore. Or so there's those types of just unintended consequences of revitalization, which happens everywhere. It's not something, you know, uncommon that happens, but it's just that being aware that that could be a potential consequence where then you're starting to push people out if they can't then afford to pay their property taxes, or if there's increased rent, then maybe they then can't pay that increased rent, which then means that they have to move to other parts of the city, which then starts to cause people being pushed out and then higher income people moving in, causing a move into gentrification, as it is called. Right. So I think it's just that awareness, right? Because investment is good. And you're right with the King Irving neighborhood being, you know, in between. It's like, you know, yeah, we could see that being implemented, and seeing King Irving start to improve over time, which is great. But then we also have to think, well, who lives in King Irving, right? And start to understand the income inequality, especially, and the racial wealth gap that we have in our country as well, and start to think about those things in consideration when we're talking about investment and reinvestment into neighborhoods, and just being aware of those unintended consequences that could come from it.
Anything else?
I don't think so. Probably, unless there are any additional questions. I will also let you guys know, you know, if there are any other folks that you think would like to hear this presentation. We do public tours every Wednesday at 2 p.m. and you can just sign up for those tours on undesigneddsm.com. would be happy to get some more of your folks on to learn more about this issue. And additionally, always scheduling tours, you know, by appointment pretty much, it's such as this one. So happy to do that at another time. And Kendall, do you have any other announcements that I'm missing? Bless you.
They said bless you.
Oh.
But no, I don't think so. No other announcements, but yeah, just please feel free to spread around our website. It's got a lot of resources, and I know we're recording this, so please feel free to send this out to your entire community. And we had a really awesome discussion, so I think that'll be beneficial for others to hear as well. So yeah, that's all I would have to add.
This was awesome, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, it was
We
great. Thank you
appreciate your
for
time.
of our horrible history, but